Hey everybody, I'm really excited about today's episode. I talked with AJ Crabill, and we had a really great conversation about how to build effective school boards focused on student outcomes. AJ shares what the singular vision and purpose for school boards should be and why so many have veered from this direction. We talked about what AJ learned from his experience in several remarkable school district turnarounds and time in state-level education leadership. And AJ shares about his upcoming book launching in March of 2023, Great on Their Behalf, Why School Boards Fail, How Yours Can Be Effective. Without any further ado, here's my conversation with AJ Crabill. All right, welcome to the Building Thinkers podcast. Today I'm so excited to be joined by AJ Crabill, and we're going to talk all things school boards and school governance and student outcomes and education. One of my favorite topics. AJ has a deep and long history that he doesn't care for people to share at the beginning of podcasts, I've learned. So I'm going to turn it right over to him and let him share a little bit about his background and a little bit about what brings him to this work. So I'd love to start, AJ, if you will, with any of the background you would like to share that brought you to this work. Why is it meaningful for you? And I know you want to dig right into it, so I'll let you start with that.
Well, Tracy, thanks so much for having me today. And I suspect I'm a lot like you and probably many of your listeners, just a deeply engaged parent who showed up at one too many meetings, and next thing you know, are highly involved in trying to ensure that all of our students are being as well served as we want our own children to be.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about, I heard a really interesting story about how you kind of started on a school board, weren't sure about it, were trying to get out of it, and then, so I don't know if you want to share maybe that story or your own history in the public schools or your children's, any of that helps us get a little bit of a picture of, again, what brings you to building this meaningful work.
Yeah, I think the specific journey related to school boards had a lot to do with, as I was trying to raise the children in my own home and make sure that they got the quality of education I wanted them to have. Eventually, there was one particular circumstance where I felt like the school wasn't meeting my kids' needs. I tried to communicate that with the principal. The principal articulated some concerns that they had and their access to supports. And so that took me to the next step. At that time, I was the head of the parent association for the school. And so the next step was to go visit with the school board. And I went and had a conversation with the school board where I told them about the pain and the struggle that my child and other children were experiencing and the concerns that the principal had and support that they need. And the board dutifully looked at me, waited for me to finish speaking, said thank you, next, and moved on to the next person. At which point I was like, well, hold on, time out. Like, these are real issues. Are we not even going to discuss this? Like, sorry, sir, we don't talk, to parents at board meetings, which was stunning to me. And so I went away very frustrated and quickly started thinking about, do we need to find different people for the school board? Now, I didn't know then the things that I know now, obviously. And I understand today what the board members meant by that is that due to open meetings laws in most states, it actually is unusual for school boards to interact with public commenters like I was at the time. But I didn't know that. All I knew is that I tried to take my issue about my students' needs to the board and felt completely unheard. And thus began a journey that one thing led to another. I wound up serving on the local school board, tried to spend a lot of time creating how are we going to be more effective at being responsive to parents in appropriate ways and venues than the experience that I had. And all of that has led me on the journey now where I have the privilege of getting to work with other boards across the country who are trying to figure out how can they modify their behavior in the boardroom to really be responsive to the needs of the students in the classroom.
So powerful. I'm thinking about one of the questions that gets us right into the meaty middle. What do people overcomplicate? And sometimes the way to think about it is, if only people knew.
I think something that people misunderstand is that the role of school boards are not to be school board experts. The role of school boards are not to be financial experts or operational experts. The role of the school board is to represent the vision and values of the community. And so what you need to be ready and qualified to be an effective school board member is able to listen for and be willingness to represent the vision that you hear from the community regarding what it wants its students to know and be able to do, and the values of the community regarding what are non-negotiables that have to be honored. As long as you can capably represent the vision and values of the community, listen for it, discern it, really distill it down to a clear, coherent understanding of the community's vision and values, and then actively invest your time as a board into ensuring that there is alignment between the school system's operations and the community's vision and values. As long as you're committed to that path, you're ready. You have everything you need, to be an effective school board member. I think a lot of people hold themselves back thinking, well, I'm just a parent, or I don't have a PhD in education, or I'm not, a attorney or an accountant or these other things. And none of those are required, but the school systems already have all of those. That's not your function as a board member. And so that I think that really helps clarify that the bar for entry is around representing the vision and values of the community, not around being a content expert in all these other areas.
That's just making me think when I think about the recent school board elections that I may or may not have seen in the state in which I may or may not live. It seems to me that I hear promoted, I am a lawyer, I am a financial expert, I am an accountant, and so I can help our school do X, Y, and Z. And so can you tell us some of the history from your perspective of how we ended up here in a place where the vision that you just laid out is beautiful and I'm on board and I want you to be the head of all the school boards everywhere? Now, how I know you have a vision for how we get from where we are to there, but can we start with going backwards? How did we get here to the school boards looking different from the vision that you just outlined?
I think largely it's not a matter of kind of passion or intention. Like school boards, as I work with school boards all across the country, it's a bunch of people like you and me who just care a lot, want something better for our kids, and are willing to put the time and energy in to help make that happen. And so that there's not a passion gap, there's not a desire gap, but I think often there is a gap in knowledge, skills, and mindset. And I certainly speak about this in my book that looks at what are some of the failure modes that boards exhibit. The first thing, is the gap in knowledge is simply understanding basic things like why does a school board exist? Is the job of the school board to operate the day-to-day work of the school district? No, it's not. If that was the case, then you really would need a lot of those additional skill sets. But it isn't. But I think a lot of people come into the school board thinking, oh, our job is to operate the day-to-day business of running a school system. And so I think that simultaneously causes some people not to run and causes other people to run thinking that that will be their job and thinking, oh, this skill set that I have is going to help me effectively manage the school system. But that's not the function. But that's a knowledge gap. That's not a passion gap. That's not a willingness. That has nothing to do with people's intention. There's just a gap in understanding. And so when there are these gaps that occur, whether it's in knowledge and skills or mindset, that is bridgeable. And my coaching, when those things are the norm, is just to find ways to give people insight into what are the things that school board members can do and that school boards can do to really improve student outcomes. What are the specific behaviors that, as board members engage in, are going to increase the likelihood that we'll see growth in what our students know are able to do. And when people lean into that work, they realize that, sure, there's value in having people have a bunch of different life experiences. So that's not to say that it's not valuable to have people from all these different professional areas. Well, I'm an attorney, I'm a doctor, I'm an engineer, I'm all these things, so that makes me the one person. Like, that experience is useful, but it's not useful for its content expertise. It's useful because it is a part of the fabric of the community. It's a part of the larger set of perspective of the community that it's job of the board to represent. And so having a really diverse board is valuable in that regard. Like, it wouldn't make sense to have a 7-member board of all teachers because now we're not actually representing the full fabric of the community, the full set of experiences that helps give an understanding of what is the vision and value of the community. And so those are valuable things to bring, but often just not for the reason people think. That the job isn't to show up and bring your professional skill set to help run the day-to-day of the school system. It's to bring all of your life experiences and to funnel that into the life experiences of your colleagues on the school board, and to collectively use that to help represent the community's vision, the community's value for what its children should know and be able to do.
You mentioned some of the things that you can do in the coaching for this, particularly this knowledge gap, to help school boards get a little bit, these are going to be my words, like on track with the true purpose, and realign to that, which is supporting student outcomes, supporting the students that are in the buildings that we're also, need to be taken care of and all of that. What are some of the things that you focus in on around student outcomes in particular once you've dug into that piece? Because I believe you have some of your history that you did not mention, have been a part of some turnarounds that are pretty remarkable. And if you want to speak to any of that.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of being involved with a couple of school systems that have had just amazing turnarounds in student performance. Went from incredibly low performing school systems at the bottom of their respective states to really demonstrating what it is to drive student growth and student learning. And in both of those cases, a significant part of those stories is the work of the board. But the work of the board is not always obvious. Like governance isn't super obvious. Management, often obvious. We've all had a manager. But we all haven't had like a governor running our, overseeing the day-to-day of our household. So often we conflate governance and management because we know management. We know what it is to kind of give day-to-day instructions and orders. And so I think that's a challenge that boards often run into. And so the first thing to get clear about, the first transformation of the mind, is to understand that school systems only exist to improve student outcomes. Like that's the only reason school systems exist. And if you're not clear about that, then the school board probably isn't the place for you. That there are a bunch of other things that school boards do, and there are other priorities that school boards juggle, but there is one reason and only one reason that school systems exist. And that's to improve student outcomes. That's to cause improvements in what our students know and are able to do. And each community has different reasons for why that's important to them, and each community has different outcomes that it wants, different things that it wants its students to know and be able to do. I work with school systems that are on the Gulf Coast, and they really want their kids to be prepped to go after some of the underwater welding jobs that are available in that region that apparently pay all kinds of money, that is a very specialized skill set I'm not familiar with, but the families in that community are very familiar with, and they want to know that when my kids leave up out of here, that they have all the knowledge and skills necessary, that if that's a passion that they want to pursue, that they can do that and they can be able to take care of their families doing that. I work in other parts of the country where the industry is technology, and they want to make sure that the STEM jobs that are available in that part of the region, that their children are in a position to reach out and be able to get access to. And so which knowledge and skills, which student outcomes school systems are really focused in on, that's a local conversation. I think each community has to wrestle with that on their own. And that's the function the school board brings to the table as representatives of the community's vision for its children. It's the school board that goes out and engages the listening, hears from the parents, hears from the community members, hears from the educators, and pulls all that into a holistic understanding of what are the things that we most want our students to know and be able to do, and how do we then begin to align the work of our school system to accomplish that. So that's step one. There's no way that a board focuses its attention on improving student outcomes if it doesn't first acknowledge that that is the sole reason for which school systems exist. And that is a more dramatic statement than it might sound. School systems don't exist to have balanced budgets. That is not why the school system exists. Is that helpful? Yes. Am I knocking balanced budgets? No, I'm a big fan. I'm fiscal conservative on that front, big time. But if we have balanced budget and little AJ can't read, have we done our job? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So school systems don't exist to have balanced budgets. School systems don't exist to have jumbotrons, regardless of what all these districts across Texas, might believe. That's not why school systems exist. School systems don't exist to provide employment. They're not employment institutions. That's not why school systems exist. We didn't say, you know what? We got all these folks who need jobs. Let's have a school system. That wasn't the thinking. At the core of all things, if school boards really want to be focused on what matters most, they have to get clear about why do school systems exist in the first place. And it's not all of the things that school boards often spend time talking about. It's that school systems exist to improve student outcomes. That is the only reason for which school systems exist. And when boards can make the transition to really wrapping their hands around that and saying this is the issue to which we will focus our allegiance as a school board, powerful things become possible for the children that they serve.
It makes so much sense to me that if we can start there, if we can be clear about the purpose, that things start to fall in line with a better understanding of what is not only important. I think something that I've seen happen is school boards get pulled into some things that they may feel are urgent, either because of the loudness of the voice or whatever is going on, or the risk aversion or whatever it might be, or the communication department, all of that. And so if we're really starting from this place of why does our organization, why does our system as a whole exist, then we start to see, like, if every department, if every piece of that system is an arrow, we start to see the arrows moving in the same direction. And then we see things like not only school board, but ideally superintendent, principals, professional learning, curriculum, all start to align in the same direction. Technology department, it becomes in service of improving student outcomes versus maybe thinking one department like curriculum, oh, y'all are the ones that really impact student outcomes, or assessment, it's you guys that really track all that. But it's
got to
this
be everybody.
Holistic, a school district is there to serve its students, and if we aren't improving outcomes, what is it that we're doing here?
Now, this is simultaneously the easiest part and the hardest part. The hard part is the easy, folks embracing this idea that school systems exist to improve student outcomes, and that is the why, that is the purpose, that is the what causes us all to be here together. That is simultaneously really, really hard, because you've got a bunch of folks who want to focus on it, but we want to do this. But it's also hard because then what happens next is everybody says, oh, well, of course it is. And the thing that I'm doing is the one thing that is the thing that's causing student outcomes. Yes. So everybody else's thing is unimportant. My thing is important. That's what makes it hard. But it's simultaneously one of the easiest things, because I tend to find most communities quickly rally around this notion. So the next step in the journey becomes really important. Is you have to have, it's not enough to have focused your mindset around this vision for why school systems exist. Then you have to begin this continuous improvement journey that honors that and centers that and places it at the focus of the constant attention. But it's the way the board does that is differently than the way the teacher would do that or the way the superintendent would do that. From the board's perspective, the next step in their journey is to clarify what the vision and values of the community are, to literally write them down and make them plain. And so example of the vision of the community is, what are the goals for our students? What do we want them to know and be able to do? You need to write that down and make it incredibly clear for folks. And then once you've done so, and you've said these are the goals, and we write them in smart fashion, specific, measurable, attainable, results-focused, time-bound, we're really crystal clear about what is the community's vision and values. Then the work begins to how are we constantly monitoring whether or not we're actually accomplishing that. It's not enough to write down the community's vision. We actually have to look at it every single month without fail, to look at, are we moving closer, and what worked this month and what didn't work, and what adjustments are we going to make. Then we have to constantly be, the next step of the journey, we have to be aligning all of our resources. And we have to, every time we make a decision, we have to make that decision in the context of, okay, what is the impact that this decision will have on the goals that we've set regarding the community's vision? When it's time to evaluate the superintendent, the majority of their evaluation should be, did students grow in the areas of the community's vision? And that should be the majority of the superintendent's evaluation. What we're really going to say is that we exist to improve student outcomes, then that has to be how we hold ourselves accountable for, are we living in our purpose? Are we standing in the accomplishments that our students deserve? And then, once the superintendent's evaluation is grounded in that, their direct reports evaluation should be grounded in that. And then all the principals' evaluation should be grounded in that, and teachers' evaluations grounded in that. We start to create this alignment in the system where everybody recognizes the way adults win is by causing children to win. So it's not enough to say the school system exists to improve student outcomes. That has to live at every single level of the organization. It has to live in all of our decisions. We have to have ways of measuring it. We have to have ways of measuring when are we moving in that direction of the community's vision and when are we not moving in the direction. And just because we're not doesn't mean we beat people over the head with it. I mean, you don't want to create a psychologically unsafe school system. Like the point of having these measurements and having people's evaluations aligned to these measurements isn't, to abuse people with the data. It is to make clear where we are meeting the promise of our children and where we are not, and then being the cause for us to make adjustments in our adult behavior that are increasingly aligned with the results that we want for children. It's possible to create that, and in the places where I've had the privilege of serving and we've done that, children have been the beneficiaries of that, and often very quickly.
It's so powerful. A couple of things it's making me think. First of all, I have nothing to disagree with in anything that has been said thus far, so that's really fun. I have no even good controversy to pull up here because I'm so in agreement. And so where I love to dig deeper is you referenced the departments or the different people, or let's even just take the school board who think this part is what's really going to make those outcomes go forward. This part is. And so I've similarly seen that in my education work, where at one point a couple years back, I would joke that my role was as a therapist between the technology department and the curriculum department, because I was really trying to be at the center to improve student outcomes. I happened to be leveraging technology, but I didn't want to be classified as only the tech person because it wasn't about that. And so I was trying to bring these people together. And many times it was these, I remember drawing a picture of literal silos and the technology department, the curriculum department. And I said, you guys, what is the purpose of all of this? And you're reminding me of an activity I used to do, and we did this activity called hexagonal thinking, and we had these hexagons printed out, and I would start the activity with, what do you want your students to be like? And there would be teachers and principals and leaders all in this, and they would write down, what do we want our students to be like? And then we would go to the next part of the hexagons and try to connect them, and we would say, well, what experiences do you think at school that students should have that would support them getting towards this place you want them to get? And they would write down things like that. And then the third section was, okay, what are the roadblocks or the things from your perspective that are standing in the way from those experiences that you just mentioned? It was kind of like a backwards, gap analysis to help them think about. But I remember that people, even just sitting at the beginning of the session thinking about what they want their students to be like, very few times did I get that I want my students to pass STAR. Of course, we know that's important, right? That is the outcomes. That's a piece of the outcomes, of course, that we're talking about. But they would say things like, I want my students to be happy. I want them to be fulfilled. And so it's interesting to me that when they were grounded in that starting point, how they were able to come together and put the hexagons together literally and think about, okay, what way can our department support getting the students to this place? And sometimes I found it is that regrounding, because like many other organizations apart from education, people get stuck in their day-to-day systems of however they are evaluated, to your point, how they are funded, how they work with their teams.
Well, unfortunately, too, I suspect in this, what you're sharing, that often it's the case that district staff, particularly central office staff, their view of am I being successful or not is often more caught up in the processes that they manage than the results that those processes are having for children. And But I largely see that as a byproduct of failed governance, where as a governing team, we failed to make the distinction that success in the school district is not measured in terms of process implementation, but measured in terms of student outcomes. And when that is the North Star, then I could perfectly implement a process. It could fail to have the intended impact for students, and that doesn't make me a failure. It just means I have clarity around the fact that my perfect implementation in this operational area wasn't perfectly aligned with the results that we want for children. And so now I've got to pivot. Inside of an adult inputs centered world, my perfect implementation of my process is my reason for being. And that is how success is measured. Inside of a student outcomes focused approach, both to governing and managing, only the result for children tells us whether or not the things that I did were the optimal things for the students that we serve. You can do all of the perfect stuff perfectly, but if it doesn't have the result in what children having growth and what they know and are able to do, the things that a community wants for its children just simply aren't made manifest. And so that shift from my purpose is causing this adult input to move forward, and I've got to protect that adult input, and I've got to glorify this adult input. The shift from that to a student outcomes focused world where I'm doing this adult input, I'm doing this particular job, but the measure of whether or not this is the thing that is the most optimal use of my time as a school system employee is, are we having an impact on the children that we intend to see? And when we're not, that means even if I did my widget in the school system perfectly, that I still probably need to look at what do I need to change in order to get us better aligned with what our students actually need. Like that's a very different approach. It's a scary approach, because if it's not done with compassion, if it's not done in an inclusive manner, it can leave people feeling beaten up on, and that doesn't serve children either. And so having a system in place where the board makes it very clear, we will stand in purpose and we will evaluate the effectiveness of our organization based on its alignment with giving our children the promise that they deserve. And when we see non-alignment of that, we won't beat up our staff, we won't denigrate our parents, we won't talk poorly about our students. What we'll do is we'll look at what adjustments do we need to make, starting here in the boardroom, that give rise to a safe space for adults in the central administration to make adjustments, that give rise to a safe space for principals and teachers to make adjustments.
That's making me think about having a spirit of inquiry when you're talking about, in particular, looking at data and being really clear about, we want to see the results here. These outcomes are what we're after. So to your point of shifting from, I love the language of the adult input, to really being focused on those student outcomes, the student output. And then that helps you go back and look at, okay, whatever it is that I'm doing as an adult is in service. And so I know if I'm on track based on these metrics. What it's making me think about is the culture of looking at data and how much of a shift that can be for everyone in the district based on experiences that they've had. I've been a part of some work that has been involved in that spirit of inquiry piece, and sometimes principals or district leaders will come to me and say, you need to understand the past of what we've been through when it comes to data to understand why we may feel certain ways about even just the word data. And I'm like, thank you so much for sharing that, because then we can ground and start our conversations to explain the shifts to a spirit of inquiry. We want to use data as not as a hammer for accountability, but sometimes it has been used in that way in the past, but instead as a magnifying glass to zoom in and get to the bottom of what is going on. And so in what we're speaking to here, then backwards mapping from that to all the systems and supports that are connected. Have you seen any of that to be true around once you get into the data? Perhaps it's once you clarify where you're headed and you get into the data, maybe it's not as much of a struggle there, but have you seen just pulling up the data itself to cause some of that fear response for adults?
Oh, absolutely. But this lives in leadership. Like where that fearfulness lives, That is a leadership dysfunction, and what you need is leaders who are willing to lead in a different way. Probably the most disturbing example of this I was visiting a school, it's an elementary school, and the principal had a letter in her office, and she shared it with me. And the letter was from one of her fifth graders. And it was one of the more struggling schools in the state. And the letter said, "I'm sorry we didn't score very well on our state test, and that you might lose your job." No child should ever be carrying that around. And I guarantee you this, the child who wrote that, she did not come up with that on her own. Somewhere an adult created that in her mind. And as a result, now we have children who aren't experiencing the freedom, to be children and to experience the joy of childhood. We've got children who are now carrying the emotional burden of adults. That is a leadership fail. Somewhere, someone who has responsibility for leadership of children in that building failed that child. That is not a conversation that, whether it was a parent who did it or a staff person who did it, that is not for children to carry. And I would go so far as to say, I would consider that abusive. But the genesis of that almost certainly didn't start in that building. There is a culture of fearfulness, and the adults in that building are heir to that culture. They are living in it and wounded by it just as much as that particular young student was very much wounded by it. And the culture of fearfulness around a focus on student outcomes begins and ends in the boardroom. It begins with how the board views its role, how it views the information that it receives. When the superintendent provides updates to the board on how our students are performing relative to the goals, if the response from the board is toxic, it inspires the superintendent to respond to their staff with toxicity, which inspires their staff to respond to the principals with toxicity, which inspires their principals to respond to teachers and parents with toxicity, which inspires teachers and parents to respond to students with toxicity. What we need is to recognize that when we're experiencing that, that is not a byproduct of data. That is a byproduct of failed leadership. There is a culture of toxicity that has to be addressed at the leadership level. And the reason I say that, to pick on Texas a little bit, the reason I say that is because we are very comfortable with children being assessed. We're very comfortable with them being assessed publicly. We're very comfortable with them being assessed publicly on a weekly basis. We're very comfortable with them receiving a public assessment on a weekly basis where there are literally groups of adults cheering for them to fail. We're very comfortable with this, and it happens every week across the state. We call it football games. It's a very public assessment of what students know and are able to do. It happens on a weekly basis, and it is very much people actively cheering for your success and your failure. This is assessment, but nobody's saying, well, we shouldn't have the scoreboard during football games. This is assessment. And so what this clarifies is that assessment isn't the issue. It's the toxicity of leadership associated with the assessment that is the issue. That is curable, but that lives in, has the board internalized their role and internalized the set of knowledge and skills necessary to implement that role in a really healthy and psychologically safe way.
I'm reflecting on my own classroom. I taught in a bilingual fourth grade classroom, and I had an amazing mentor teacher who I think just really sheltered me from all of kind of the drama and just let me be me and really nurtured me, and I think grew my skills way beyond what a first year teacher should have been able to do. I'm thinking about my perception of the assessments at that time. As I was thinking, I didn't actually feel the pressure of the assessment at that time. And so maybe, again, because it was the first year they had a fourth grade bilingual teacher at that campus, they didn't have anything to compare it to, so they weren't pressuring me. But what I felt like was I was given the freedom and support to serve my students where they were, and that ended up being through a variety of what now I know is blended and personalized learning work. And you know what? They did just fine. It just made me reflect on it, because I think somehow I was protected from that. And so now I think when I look at the systems, I want that for our students to be in classrooms where teachers feel free and full of joy and creativity, because people get involved in education, obviously not for the paycheck, not for the pat on the back, but because they do deeply care for the outcomes of students. And so what's so fascinating to me is I see teachers and campus leaders and district leaders have those mindset shifts that you're speaking about. I'm more involved on that side than on the governance side in my consulting work. But I see that mindset shift when it plays out alongside also those outcomes. They realize it doesn't have to be a one or the other. There's some sort of false narrative that it's like we can either be joyful and creative and do these things, or we can really make our scores improve. And it's like, wait a minute, has anybody looked at any of the research on how kids learn? But I think where I'm headed with this is, what have some of your takeaways been around some of the specific practice shifts or adult mindset shifts that you think have been a part of that student outcome shift? So let's say they looked at their data, they realized there was something amiss. What have you seen school boards really do that has made an impact in those outcomes that you can draw that through line for?
Yeah, so a few thoughts on this, and I'm going to be super curious to hear where this aligns with your experience or not. You have different types of data that's used for different purposes. So you have the data that's summative, that's your lag data, that you don't know that till the end of the year. That's kind of like, we don't know who won or lost the game until the game is already over. By the time you have the data on who won and lost, it's too late to impact who won and who lost. So that's your lag data. That's your summative data. It doesn't show up till the end of the year. And that tends to be the data that gets all of this focus and attention. But it's actually really only useful one time of year, and that's when it comes out. The rest of the year, it's not particularly useful to you because you can't use it to cause practice changes. If we really want student outcomes to improve, the only place we should expect that's going to happen is in the classroom. It's going to happen in this interaction between the learner and the educator. And in that magical moment is where education either succeeds or does not. And so if what we're doing isn't causing performance improvements in that interaction between the educator and the learner, then whatever we're doing, whether it's in the boardroom or the superintendent's room or the principal's office, it's probably not going to make a bit of difference for children. And so everything has to be calibrated against how is this causing changes in that interaction that are aligned with students getting more and more and more of what they need. And when we look at in the classroom, the way that happens is the basic continuous improvement cycle. Is you have a plan, you implement the plan, you do some formative assessment to figure out, okay, we taught a little bit about the sound that C, A, and T makes to little AJ. Now let's do a little check-in and figure out, little AJ, can you read this? Okay, you can't yet. So all that tells me is that I had a plan, I deployed the plan didn't quite work out. So, Tracy, tell me, what do you want that teacher to do next?
Yeah, go back and teach those phonemes.
Yeah, you're going to go reteach. That's all it is. This isn't the occasion for beating up on the teacher. This isn't the occasion for anything else. It's just that formative information, that formative data just tells us what the current score is. And we're not winning the game yet. No problem. Let's come up with a different play, grab a different play out of the playbook, run that play, and then look at the scoreboard and see if we're closer to where we want to be. And if that doesn't work, we reteach. We come up with a new plan and we reteach, and we stay with that to try to figure out how do we get little AJ to where we want him to be. That basic continuous improvement cycle. Get clear about what we're trying to accomplish. Get clear about how we're going to measure it. Deploy a plan that's aligned to accomplishing it, look at the data, figure out where we need to adjust, and then do it all over again and again and again. That same continuous improvement cycle that lives in the classroom is the same one that I want to invite boards to adopt in the boardroom is that the step one is get clear about my mindset. Why are we here? We're here to improve student outcomes. Okay, what specifically does that mean? Let's clarify the priorities and get really narrowed down into what are the specific goals that are smart that we're going to use to identify whether or not we're honoring the community's vision or not. Okay, once we've got that, but the problem is those goals, those are the lag measures. Those are the summative data. That tells you at the end, once the game is already over. So we also need some formative data. We also need some interim data that tells us throughout the year, how are we performing? And the frequency of measurement gives rise to the frequency of pivot. Each time that I measure something, that gives me some insight into am I closer to where I want to be or not. And if I'm closer, maybe do some more of that. And if I'm not, maybe make some adjustments and then do some more of it. And then after all of that is done, we start the whole process over again. That's the specific behavior pattern. Nowhere in there is glorification of state assessment. Nowhere in there is test prep starting in January. Like, the data on this is painfully evident. I don't know why this practice still persists, but it does. But this is not powerful. This is not transformative in the learning of children. In fact, when I was with the state agency in Texas, and part of my work was to support our school improvement teams, I'd go out and visit a lot of our lowest performing schools across the state. In particular, I'd often want to visit the ones that used to be on the lowest performing list of schools, but had made the leap. Like, I want to know, what are they doing? What's the magic? What are they bringing to it? And it became so common that it was almost laughably so that the story of schools that made this massive leap frequently sounded like this. Well, we got a new principal came in, and she took down all the charts that said, star this, star that, the state assessment. And instead she said, let's focus in on tier 1 instruction. Let's just really execute right here. Here's the formative and interim data we're going to use to figure out if we're on the path. And we're going to look at this constantly, not to tell us what we're worth or our value as teachers, but just to figure out, do we have to pivot? Do we need to reteach? And to figure out whose lesson plan worked. Okay, great. Then next time around, everybody, we're grabbing her lesson plan, and we're going to start there. And if you can build on that, great. And all of a sudden, discussions about the summative assessment completely disappear. In fact, many of the lowest performing schools, I'd go in there, it'd be all state assessment all day, every day on every wall. And that's all they talk about constantly. And then they start prepping for the state assessment in January and February. Horrible behaviors. And these ones that made the leap, almost without exception, I'd go into the schools and say, what'd you do? Oh, we just taught kids. But when you really had them break it down, they got focused on this really tight, continuous improvement cycle, and that's where they lived. They didn't even talk about the STAR test, and so then it'd come time for STAR assessment, and the week before STAR, the day or two before STAR, they say, hey, we're going to show you a little bit about the items that are going to be on the test so that you understand those. They spend no more than about a half a day on that, because that amount of test prep is actually really valuable. An item analysis, so students don't get tripped up on why the questions worded the way they are. But anything more than about a half a day, maybe a day of test prep is, I consider, educational malpractice. And so the day before STAR test, they could say, hey, we're going to give you some idea of what the items look like tonight. Get some rest, tomorrow, get a good meal, and then come on in. We're going to take a test. This isn't about you all. This is about how well we're serving you. It gives us some information. Don't worry about it. Don't overthink it. Just do your best, and then we'll get back to our regular lessons at the end of the week. The kids come in the next day. They look at the STAR test. It's spelled STAAR. STAR is spelled wrong on this thing, right? It's like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Just take the test, do your best, and we'll move on. And the students were literally so unfamiliar with the STAR assessment because it just wasn't a part of their daily lives that was their first thought. It's like, why is this spelled wrong? I've never seen it spelled this way. It's like, those weird people in Austin, that's what they do. That narrative I got used to hearing over and over and over. And what it suggested is a couple things. One is that a lot of the practices that you see are, I think, invested in out of fear about adult concerns rather than the aspirations we have for our students. Again, I strongly hold the position that has its genesis in a failure of leadership in the boardroom. That there is a culture that is possible for our teachers to operate in that hasn't been made manifest by the leadership that's been exhibited in the boardroom. I think the second thing that it lifts up is that there is real opportunity, that the improvement in student outcomes aren't reliant on, well, we need $1 million more, aren't reliant on, well, we've got the wrong teachers, or we've got the wrong children, we've definitely got the wrong parents. Like, it's not about those things. It's just about this continuous improvement, these tight circles of continuous improvement where we're deploying a plan, we're looking at how it worked, we're making adjustments, we're deploying a plan, we're looking at how it worked, we're making adjustments. And that our focus is deeply in what is the ongoing impact we're experiencing on our students, and how are we realigning what we're doing as adults to be responsive to whatever this information is telling us about, what little AJ does or doesn't know how to do. That's the work that seems to be transformative for children and is lifted up by a student outcomes focused approach that sees our job as improving what students know and able to do, but is impeded by an adult inputs focus where the job is to execute on widget A, and that's, well, they told me that I had to, rush the kids through this curriculum, and I did, so that means I did my job, and if the kids can't learn, well, it's probably the kid's fault, or it's the central office's fault, or it's somebody else's fault. Like, that isn't centering what's possible for children. It's centering the fears and the anxieties of adults. And just like the story I told earlier, I think those get transmitted to our children in ways that are just really, really harmful, and then create this whole cycle of downward spiral that doesn't serve our children, but also doesn't serve our adults. I don't know how much any of that resonates for your experience, but that's certainly been mine.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the mindset shifts I've seen is this idea of teachers going from, well, I've covered the curriculum. Well, did students learn? And I think about, did students understand the words that were coming out of your mouth? And did that translate into them being able to perform, not just on, again, the summative assessment, but those formative assessments? Also, I will note that your sports metaphor for summative and formative assessment is the most helpful I've heard in a very long time. I used to do a whole session on formative and summative assessment and thought I had really great metaphors, but that one would have been helpful, again, about 10 years ago. I just want to reiterate that cycle, and I think that it's one of those things where both those internal to the district and those external, I'm external, trying to help districts and try to help organizations and leadership roles and things like that. Always, I'm driven by impact, so I always want to see impact, and part of the Building Thinkers vision is really spending my career on unleashing human potential. And through learning experiences and things like that, and for much of my career it's been specific to education. It's interesting because I've been working with some corporate environments, and it's the exact same problems. It's the exact same organizational struggles. It's the exact same leadership struggles. They have different terms and names, but to what you're speaking to about the continuous improvement, I could not agree more. I think that we get distracted by the shiny, we get distracted by the loud, we get distracted by the next thing that's going to change education. And the reality is we know a lot about how kids learn. We have a ton of research, for example, in literacy, and we need to follow through on it. And we have MRIs that are able to show exactly how kids' brains learn to read. And then we have curriculum and curriculum providers who are still providing things that are not aligned to that science of reading. And that's education malpractice. And you can go listen to a lot of podcasts about that. We hit on a sore subject for me here.
You and me both.
I think that there's plenty of work to be done, and I do think it is, I find my role a lot of times is helping us get back to the simplicity of, okay, so these are our goals of what we want to work towards. What are we seeing right now? Let's say all the wins. Now let's say all the gaps of where we aren't there yet against the vision. And then we say, what's our action plan? To your point, I wrote down where you were saying the frequency of the measure should align to the frequency of the pivot. That's the exact cycle of approach we've used to say at those intervals and in alignment with your assessment data that's a part of that. we're going to pivot, and then the majority of our work is those supporting the leaders, help them build the capacity to just stay focused. Just do the action plan that you wrote down, and the next time you come back around, if you have the same things on your action plan, we're going to have words. Because you should have new things on your action plan because you were supposed to implement those things. And then it really isn't, the rocket science to me is staying on track, staying focused, and then also making sure that the shifts, the pivots that you're making are aligned to research.
I think one of the points that you lift up, though, I think definitely bears constant repeating, is that there is this kind of noise to signal ratio where if leaders are doing our jobs, that we're actually reducing the noise that staff are experiencing so that they can stay focused in on the few things that most are requiring of their attention. This is where I start to question a lot of the practice I see in school systems, not because there aren't good intentions, but teachers aren't magical. Like they're human. And so there's a finiteness to what they can do. And the more that we load on top of them, the less of each individual thing that they can accomplish. The analogy that I give to school board members is, I'll often ask all the board members in the room, who here has the biggest truck? And somebody will raise their hand. Invariably, it'd be like this 4-foot tall grandma who's got like this monster truck. It's like, all right, ma'am, how many miles per gallon is your truck giving? It'd be something absurd, like 10 miles a gallon. I was like, got it. All right, that's a big truck, ma'am. Well done. It's like, okay, so now let's imagine you got 2 trucks, 2 identical monster trucks that you're driving. If you put 1 gallon of gas and you now divide it amongst them, how far can those 2 trucks go? And people say, oh, well, a little under 5 miles, each, because they each got half a gallon. Okay, got it. All right, so let's say you divide it, among 4 trucks. You got 4 identical of these big trucks. You put 1 gallon of gas and you divide among the 4. How far can they go? Well, probably not even 2.5 miles, maybe less, maybe just 2, Like, okay, got it. Now let's say you have 10 identical trucks. You divide that gallon of gas among these 10 huge trucks. How far will each of them go? And eventually somebody starts to figure it out. It's like, actually, they're probably not even going to turn on, because I don't even know if a tenth of a gallon of gas is going to be enough to start ignition if that's the only thing in that truck. And it starts to give this understanding that every teacher's got a gallon of gas to work with each day. If we're asking her to do 10 things, none of those 10 things are ever leaving the parking lot. But if we ask her to do 1, 2, maybe 3 things, we'll get a ways down the road. But if you want to get the furthest down the road, maybe only ask for 1 thing, and then you can get 10 miles down the road. But if you need to do 2 things, that's fine. But just be comfortable with the fact that those 2 things are only going to get 5 miles down the road. You're not going to get 10 miles down the road on both of them. And when you can start to get clear about that, it makes it obvious that part of the function of leadership is helping to narrow out all of the noise of all of the other things, all of the other trucks competing for that gallon of gas, and saying, no, if we're really going to honor the outcomes we want for our students, these other trucks are really good trucks. We're not saying they're not good trucks. They're really good trucks. But if we put gas in them, it has the effect of removing gas out of the literacy truck. It's removing gas out of the numeracy truck. It's removing gas out of the critical thinking truck. It's removing gas, out of the problem-solving truck. And so if you want to put gas in these other trucks, that's fine. But just understand what the cost is. Effective leadership, starting with the school board, has to have the effect of removing the noise of so many other competing priorities and say, teachers, we want you to be great at delivering instruction. And we're going to try to take off your plate as much else as we possibly can that doesn't have you stand in your greatness in that task. But that lives in the board's willingness to say, here's the vision and values of the community, and we're going to narrowly define it. It's only going to be a few items. We're not going to have, the board's not going to adopt 10 goals. The board's not going to adopt, because we don't want to spread a gallon of gas across 10 trucks. In our coaching, we invite boards adopt. We recommend 3 or fewer, definitely no more than 5. And that's it. But then at that moment, part of the reason boards don't want to behave this way is because the moment I adopt 3 goals and say these are the things we're going to put gas into, there's about 100 other things that I've simultaneously just said we're not putting gas into. And particularly if I'm an elected official, when somebody rolls up on me in the grocery store next week, when I'm busy trying to prick out some non-squishy produce, they say, well, hold up, you all adopted goals, and how come there's not a goal about this thing that's really important, and this thing, that, the other, and all of a sudden the attention gets divided, and people are meetings, and they're yelling at each other, and how come my thing is... And so often, as an elected official, it's easier just to give everybody what they want. Nope, we got a goal for you. You get a goal, and you get a goal. I refer to it as the Oprah method of goal setting. Everybody, look under your seat. Everybody gets a goal. You get a goal. You get a goal. And the problem with that is, now we got 57 trucks sitting in the parking lot, and everybody's really proud of themselves because, we got 57 trucks. Ain't none of them going nowhere. And in that moment, we've cashed in what's possible for children to be pleasing to the preferences and desires of adults. This is what it means to be adult input focused rather than student outcomes focused. The effect of that in the boardroom absolutely trickles throughout the organization and creates so much noise that it's hard for teachers to be able to be the best version of themselves in the classroom.
100%. If everything is a priority, then nothing's a priority.
Nothing at all.
And I was, there was something I was reading recently talking about how the word priority, when it was actually first came on the scene in like the 1600s or something, or the 1500s, it was only singular. There was no plural form priorities. It was only priority.
One.
And it wasn't until, guess, the Industrial Revolution. Thank you, Industrial Revolution. I'm so glad we're able to use this technology in this way, and I'm very grateful for all of that. But what became now priorities and has translated again and again into more. And I think, I've seen exactly what you're speaking to. And I think that getting some brave leaders in the school board, in the superintendent's roles, to set the vision that you just laid out for us and walk that pathway of continuous improvement, really focused on student outcomes and adjusting adult mindsets along the way in a kind way, in a psychologically safe way. Yeah. I can see the fruitfulness of that and the alignment from the governance side to those who are being governed on the side that I typically work in. And so, we could just talk for hours. This has been so much fun. I have to let you get to your book. Will you please share about the book that's coming out in March?
Yeah. It's just a matter of trying to distill all of this down. I've been meaning to write this for a number of years. People have been harassing me about it. And so I finally, last year, said, I'm doing this. So I got it written, expected to land on Amazon in March. But essentially, it's about what does the path look like for boards to go from failure to effectiveness? And again, the mistake that is often made is people think, if school boards are failing, it's because they're bad people and we just need to get good people on the school board. I fell victim to this narcissistic thinking myself when I ran for the school board. I was totally a fool about that. It's evil people wanting to see black children fail. That's why the board's not great. That's not it at all. That's narcissism. That's arrogance of the highest order. I'm working with school systems all across Texas, all across the country. I see nothing to evidence that at all. If you run across 1,000 school board members, 999 of them are going to be the salt of the earth. There's one knucklehead in every group. But the vast majority of school board members are people who are deeply committed to what's possible for children. The challenge is not an intention gap, it's an implementation gap. So the idea behind the book is, what does it take to move from failure as a board to effectiveness? And when I say failure, I don't mean these humans, they're failed people. I mean failure to accomplish improvement in student outcomes. And we have to label as that. We can't tiptoe around the fact that if we exist to improve student outcomes, the student outcomes are improving, then we have failed at our why. We have failed at our purpose. That doesn't make us bad people. It does mean we have an obligation to make a pivot. That's why we have to be clear about it. So some people get squishy. AJ, why are you saying that this board failed? Because our children didn't get what they deserved. And so we do have to be comfortable with acknowledging this failed to achieve purpose. And because it failed to achieve purpose, that is all of the evidence we need that it's time to make a pivot. And so then the challenge of the book is, what does it look like to make that pivot? And so the book's called Great on Their Behalf, Why School Boards Fail and How Yours Can Become Effective. And it looks at basically the same thing that we've just described. First, starts by identifying what are many of the failure conditions that we're experiencing and where are those coming from and how can we diagnose and try to address those failures. But then it transitions in the second 2/3 of the book to really dig into what is this continuous improvement process for school boards. That is the 5 pieces that we've talked about. First, a focused mindset. Why do school systems exist? Why do school boards exist? Then clarify the priorities, monitor the results, align the resources, and then ultimately the last piece that we haven't talked about is communicate the results. That school boards don't work for school boards work for communities. And so as that continuous improvement cycle is going on, school boards do have a proactive obligation to go back to the communities they serve and communicate about what's working and not working, not a sugar-coated version of it, a clear-eyed, sober resuscitation of here's what's working, here's what's not working, and here's what the school system's plan is to move our children forward. And so that's what the book is all about. Again, great on their behalf, why school boards fail, how yours can become effective, and should be out in March on Amazon.
Awesome. So if I put a link in the show description, can I link to a pre-order?
So what I'll provide for folks is a link to a sample, just the introduction, the first chapter, and give folks a flavor of what's going on, and then as well as then it links to opportunity to receive email message as soon as it hits on Amazon so that people will automatically be notified.
Wonderful. AJ, are there any other resources you'd like to share? Any other books, any other podcasts that come to mind that you've found to be powerful that you think our listeners may like to?
A book that I read that kind of lingers with me, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask this question right now, only because I was looking at it last night, is a book that's really been instrumental to me in my leadership journey of really being open to having a rigorous and clear evaluation of myself and how I'm showing up as a leader and who I'm being in the moment. And am I standing in my purpose? And I'm measuring that stance on my intentions, or am I measuring it on my impact? That book is called Leadership and Self-Deception. And I just really would recommend it to anyone who's thinking about serving on a school board, serving in school system leadership, serving in school campus leadership. It's just a really great opportunity to kind of look within and try to identify what are the roadblocks that I've created in my own leadership practice that are preventing me from inspiring the best in the people around me.
Thank you. AJ, it's been so wonderful. Again, I think we could keep going for hours. What strikes me is your absolute clarity to, in essence, to practice what you preach here, to be so laser focused on what your impact is. And it's been so clear and remarkable already. I'm delighted that we got to have this time and excited to see your book come out and to see the continuation of the incredible impact of the work you're doing across the country. So thank you. Thanks so much for listening to the Building Thinkers podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. And if you enjoyed what you heard, please leave a podcast rating and review. That helps more listeners find us in the world of podcasting algorithms. You can find out more about my learning and development strategy services at buildingthinkers.com. And remember, there's no limit to what you can learn.